First, I would like to say, well, welcome to everyone for joining us at this really quite intriguing and really great event. First of all, I would like to say something about the Strand. So this is the Psychology of Health and Wellbeing strand, and this is a strand which doesn't have as long a history as the CUSP and the FCIG strands do. In fact, our formal recognition is around a year old. It's also a bit more heterogeneous strand. We are composed of three themes. One of our themes is counseling and psychotherapy. Another theme is critical approaches to mental health. And the third stream is well-being in context. Now, when we invited Helen Spandler to talk at this event, clearly her approach is, on the face of it, the closest to our critical approaches to mental health theme. However, I think what she will talk about is quite clearly relevant, not just to the psychology of health and well-being strand as such, but I think for the School of Psychology and perhaps for the entire university. This is because Helen will talk about openness, and whilst it's in our mission statement that we are open to, the university mission statement, we are open to people, places, methods, ideas. Helen will talk about something which relates to these, but it's something else. She will talk about being open to experiences. Now, to introduce Helen, she is a professor of mental health studies at the University of Central Lancashire, where she has been working from the early 2000s. However, her publication record starts much earlier. In fact, it starts with a 1992 essay by the title "To Make an Army Out of Illness." This was originally written in the 80s as an undergraduate. And this essay was a short history of the Socialist Patients Collective of Heidelberg and was published in the radical mental health magazine, Asylum. This is a magazine Helen now edits and, by her own acknowledgement, takes every opportunity to promote. I'm stealing her thunder, I'm promoting it now. Since then, Helen has researched extensively issues of theory, practice, policy, history, and politics of mental health care, where she also worked in service user involvement capacity. More specifically, she locates her work in the emerging field of MAD studies. Helen's writings cover a broad field, from therapeutic communities through the history of psychiatric treatment of lesbian and bisexual women in England, to a recent award-winning paper on exploring the case for truth and reconciliation in mental health services, and also a booklet for sports organizations about including non-binary gender people in sport. Currently, Helen holds a Wellcome Trust Investigator Award, and she's exploring radical mental health, exploring radical mental health zines, and she will say, I think, more about this later. Today, she will talk to us about the politics of mental health, taking experience seriously. Professor Helen Spandler, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and over to you.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
that's great. Hi, everybody. Gosh, thank you. You've done your research, David. You've dug out some stuff that I probably wouldn't have mentioned, but yeah, thank you very much for that.
It was fun.
Nice. Yeah, that's great. And I'm just going to try and share my screen so you can see my presentation. Hopefully this will come up now. There's lots of images on the slide, so that's probably why it's taking a while to upload. So while it is uploading, I'll just to say thank you so much for the invitation to be with you here today. When I accepted the invitation a long time ago, I honestly hoped we would be I'd be with you today, and we'd all be together, and we could talk and really celebrate the launch of the centre. Unfortunately, that's not to be. But it's a great honour to be addressing this centre, and also to follow Anne Phoenix, whose work I've followed since I did my PhD in a psychology department over 20 years ago. And the idea of normalised presence and pathologised absence was a real sort of key influence for myself and colleagues at the time. So instead of being in psychology, which I haven't been since, I've tried to plough a transdisciplinary field of critical mental health, or MAD studies. I hope you can see my slides now, and I've put a picture of what I hoped I would be doing if we were here in person. Is that okay? Can people see the slides okay? Yeah. It's really weird not getting feedback. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So yeah, as David said, I hope this makes my talk especially relevant to the critical mental health strand of PHeW, but hopefully it will speak to the wider discipline too. So I've tried to make my talk self-contained, so it is possible to listen and not look at the screen, because I know a lot of you, well, I certainly am experiencing screen fatigue. However, I have included quite a few slides with images from radical mental health magazines and zines, grassroots DIY publications, especially psychiatric survivor literature. And I've done this because it reflects my current preoccupation, but it's also central to the theme of my talk. I want to suggest that engaging with this kind of material is one way to take experience seriously. And I'll also, given it's a keynote, shamelessly refer to some of my own work. I want to show, by doing this, how I've tried to incorporate experiential knowledge into my own work, which I'm currently doing through zines. But I just wanted to give a bit of some caveats and a bit of a preamble, which is that I found this talk really difficult to write, partly because it increased my anxiety when I knew it was going to be virtual. I really struggle with technology, and adapting to new social norms and conventions is really scary. It's taken me a whole lifetime to try and get used to the old ones, which were hard enough. And now to try and get used to these new ones is difficult, particularly in relation to my own lived experience of anxiety and neurodiversity. And giving talks and papers, especially when I've given the title about lived experience, is really risky and anxiety provoking. It's also difficult as it requires coherence and rationality. And this isn't always a feature of lived experience, which is usually messy and contradictory, especially experiences that are classified as mad or mentally ill or mentally disordered. Another reason that I found this talk difficult to write is, like all the main speakers in this event, I'm a professor, albeit a reluctant one at times. Yet one of the things I want to do is to challenge the idea of who generates knowledge, what knowledge is valued, and how it's generated. And I go back to a really important paper written many years ago now, about 20 years ago, What Have the Romans Ever Done for Us? By the late Colin Barker and Lawrence Cox. And they challenge the relevance of academic theory for social movement activism. And I suggest that key learning in the mental health field has primarily come from what they term movement intellectuals, or what Gramsci called organic intellectuals, i.e. activists who've emerged from social movements, and in this case primarily psychiatric survivors, some of whom of course might be academics too, and they're not mutually exclusive categories. Caveats like this are important because in a world of increasing polarizations, never more so in the politics of mental health, we need more, not less nuance. But nuance feels risky too when we're increasingly asked to take sides, and sometimes we need to do that. So as my anxiety rises when I'm talking about this stuff, I think as an academic, as the psychodynamically inclined of you will be aware, we often try and relieve our anxieties. And as academics, we do that through intellectualizations. And I'm always recalling C. Wright Mills in his book, The Sociological Imagination, talking about hiding behind either the bloated puffery of high theory or abstract empiricism, i.e. data taken out of the context of people's lives. And the psi disciplines, psychology, psychiatry, and other related professions, have arguably used diagnosis and psychological formulations of some sort or other as a way to distance ourselves from lived experience. I've tried not to do that here, but there are risks in doing so, and these risks are acutely felt. I don't think this is just an individual problem, although it is felt at an individual level. Neither is it, I hope, just a confessional or a cop-out. I hope it speaks to wider concerns, particularly in relation to the theme of my talk. These things are important to acknowledge because if we really want to open up to lived experience, we need to be aware of what kinds of experiences and therefore what kinds of people our own research and academic practices include or exclude. So with this in mind and related to my current preoccupation with zines, you might think for all these reasons, I've increasingly thought that my talk would be much better as a DIY zine rather than a talk. So for all these reasons, caveats and anxieties, it's quite hard to pull together a coherent talk. But whilst I'm currently developing my zine making skills, which are very basic, in the meantime, I'll try and deliver the rest of this talk, which will hopefully include some food for thought and discussion. So taking my cue, as David said, from the theme of the new research centre to open up psychology and connect it with social justice concerns, it'll probably be evident by now that I want to consider the inclusion of experiences that psychologists used to disparagingly refer to exhibiting abnormal psychology or psychopathology. Now we might refer to these as psychosocial diversities or disabilities or neurodiversities. Influenced by the emerging field of mad studies, I'll use the term madness as shorthand here, albeit aware of some of the difficulties with doing so. And when I do this, I'm referring to experiences that are classified as psychopathological by others, including, most notably, psychology and other psi disciplines. It is these experiences I will suggest that we very much need to take seriously. But I will also suggest that for multiple reasons, taking these experiences seriously is not easy. And I know this has been a theme throughout the launch of this centre. But I would also argue that whilst it is necessary, it's also ultimately rewarding. As David also said, I've spent most of my, for 25 odd years now, working on Asylum magazine. And now editing it. And I'm putting these up really partly to do what David said, to promote the magazine, but also as an example of how I've tried to engage with lived experience. I've read Asylum magazine from before I was an undergraduate actually, and increasingly I read more submissions to Asylum than I do academic articles. And that's partly because I edit it, but it's also because I find the submissions, mostly from survivors, most challenging and unsettling and important than most academic articles that I'm reading. So it's an interesting time to be focusing on opening up psychology and connecting it with social justice concerns. It's particularly in the context of a new wave of experientially based progressive new social movements, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and the trans movement. But in this case, it's notable that mad people have yet to have their Me Too Mad Lives moment, despite all our efforts in Asylum and the survivors movement and the Mad Pride movement. So going back to the idea of social justice, people who are designated mad are really quintessential sufferers of what Miranda Fricker has referred to as epistemic injustice, both testimonial and hermeneutic. These are complex ideas, but it really boils down to the fact that their experiential knowledge is not taken seriously. It's routinely undermined, and silenced. So whilst more and more people are demanding their experientially based human rights, and quite rightly non-human rights too, legal scholars refer to human rights exceptionalism when it comes to mad people. The fact that mad people's rights can be legally overridden is still enshrined in mental health laws. So critical mental health scholars and activists argue that mad people's voices have been historically marginalised and silenced, primarily, at least in recent history, or at least rubber stamped or codified through the Psy disciplines. And it's suggested that these disciplines construct and impose pathologizing stories about madness and mad people that effectively limits, constrains and flattens our understanding and experience through psychiatric diagnosis and psychological formulations of various kinds, what Foucault famously referred to as a monologue of reason about madness. So from asylum care to community care to recovery or post-community care, from psychoanalysis to behaviourism, cognitive behavioural therapy, dialectical behaviour therapy, and all the acronyms of new therapies that the Psy disciplines come up with. Ultimately, arguably, the Psy disciplines are still constructing knowledge about madness and not with it, or even really from it. I remember Mike Lawson, who was a member of the Mental Patients Union in the 1970s when I interviewed him for my PhD research, that despite all the great innovations in mental health services, mad people really never get to play with the ball. This isn't just in the 1970s. This is a recent submission I've just had from Patrick Wood that will appear in the next issue of Asylum magazine. And Patrick talks here about how he is often, as a service user, his experience is used to add spice or experiential value to proceedings, but rarely to have much impact in the actual content or the decisions that are made. So for all these reasons, Diana Rose, who's a professor of user-led research, suggests in a recent paper the task is to trouble that silence and to let madness speak. However, as I'm sure she'd be the first to admit, it's rarely as simple as just removing structural barriers, important though they are, or abolishing or even reforming the Psy professions, flawed as they may be. While Psy practices are deeply entangled with wider social practices of discrimination and oppression, i.e. they're intersectional, it's complex, and the injustices that mad people suffer are not just reducible to either Psy practices or wider social suffering. So opening up psychology to social justice and the subjects of psychology has, of course, a long history. And this history is inextricably tied to social movements. So arguably the last time we had such a groundswell of new social movements was in the late 60s and early 70s with women's liberation, gay liberation, etc. And then psychologists who were critical of the conservatism and individualism of their own profession produced radical magazines like Red Rat, which was called the Journal of Abnormal Psychologists. This was in the early 1970s. And at the same time, we also saw early survivor literature, such as this, which was the first document of the Mental Patients Union, and also in 1971, the famous Fish Manifesto. And at that time, one of the key debates was about whether psychology is a tool of oppression or liberation of psychologized and psychiatrized subjects. A provocative, if probably unhelpful binary, which I won't get into here, but is still worthy of note. So there's another binary lurking in the back of this talk, which is the binary, of course, between madness and sanity. And if we start using the term madness, are we then evoking the idea of sanity? So for hopefully obvious reasons, I don't want to do that. But I do think we need to address what I've elsewhere referred to as the elephant in the room, i.e. the more unsettling and difficult aspects of lived experience. This is why I think it is useful to use the term madness. As Catherine Church, the Canadian mad studies scholar, argues, when we use the term mad, it unsettles us. It makes us stop and think and imagine experiences prior to psychologization, psychiatrization. The other reason it's good to talk about madness, I think, is that mental health field is increasingly full of euphemisms, like mental health itself. I'm even a professor of mental health studies, mental health services, mental health policy. None of these are really about mental health. They're about managing mental illness or mental disorder, however defined. And bizarrely, this has even led to people referring themselves as suffering from mental health. So while this apparent anomaly could mean that societal notions of mental health itself are unhealthy, which I think is probably true, I suggest that despite, or maybe even because of all the recent work being done to challenge stigma and to do user involvement, madness is still really disavowed. We're apparently much better talking about mental health, but we still don't really know how to talk about madness, let alone take it seriously. So with all the well-meaning anti-stigma and mental health awareness campaigns, psychiatric survivors are well aware of the limitations of this. Just want to give the next slide is a couple of zines which speak to this issue. The Screaming Awareness Zine week is a particular favourite of mine because it really highlights some of the issues of Mental Health Awareness Week, and Rachel calls it Screaming Awareness Week. Why it's way past time to talk. It's time to scream, let's bang our heads on the wall. Rachel's work is particularly important because it uses humour and satire, and that's a key feature of survivor contestation around lived experience. So going back to my key question, on the surface at least, there seems to be common agreement on the importance of what's called lived experience. So everybody would agree we need to take experience seriously, we need to talk about lived experience. What does that really mean in practice? Are we only referring to other people's experiences and not our own? This is something that Tamsin Walker, a cartoonist and now PhD researcher on my zine project, speaks to in this cartoon that we published in the latest issue of Asylum. The idea that if you're a survivor researcher or a service user, then people who are not are researchers without lived experience. In any way, what is experience if it isn't lived? Who has experiences that aren't lived? But more importantly, how does this apply to mad experiences? So experiences that are, by definition, outside of our normally accepted, shared understandings of what is normal and rational, or even in some cases, what it means to be human. I referred before to the idea that human rights are no longer human when you're under the Mental Health Act. So following Peter Sedgwick's searing critique of so-called anti-psychiatry scholars in his classic book, Psychopolitics, I really don't want to romanticize madness, and that is one of the problems with mad studies scholarship, arguably. Far from it, I'm only too painfully aware of the ongoing reality of serious and long-term mental health problems. And Sedgwick, after all, predicted the problems that the impact of anti-psychiatry sentiments and practice would have in current context of neoliberal austerity and things like the recovery model. The idea that madness is constructed and contested is pretty well rehearsed amongst critical scholars and activists. And it's this contention or contestation which is at the core of what Sedgwick referred to as psychopolitics, or what I'm calling here the politics of mental health. But I think it's perhaps less acknowledged amongst critical scholars, apart from people like Sedgwick, except through problemizing, pathologizing concepts, discourse and practices, the difficult, painful and unsettling aspects of madness and mad relations. So madness is deeply paradoxical, and experiential knowledge offers important insights into what I've started to think of as paradoxical truths. This is why the Icarus Project, what was called the Icarus Project in the States, has referred to madness as a dangerous gift. And I think that really nicely sums up the paradoxical issues in relation to madness. And I'm just putting a slide up here of a few Icarus Project zines, because they've produced some really interesting zines around issues of navigating the dangerous gift that is madness, particularly in relation to mania and what's called bipolar. So what I want to suggest is that mad knowledge throws up inconvenient implications or inconvenient complications, conflicts, tensions and contradictions, both for the person experiencing what's seen as madness and for society, and especially for the psi disciplines. After all, madness outwits disciplinary colonisation, i.e. it refuses to be known or pinned down by any professional discipline or sub-discipline. Mad studies itself has been described as an indiscipline rather than a new discipline. And for good reasons, because madness by definition, that's what makes it mad, if you like, is unsettling, unruly and troublesome. In this context, there are some similarities between mad studies and queer studies, if anyone out there is, and I'm thinking about Darren Langridge's talk last week, that there are quite a few similarities here. I've picked up some of these in a blog that I wrote with Meg John Barker and in an article in Asylum magazine. So there are important similarities between mad and queer, particularly in relation to how both try and flip the microscope to look instead of looking at the pathologized subject or bodies, to look at how practices are enacted to marginalize and what normal practices are, or to examine what you might call normalizing practices. And it's not just about treating madness or liberating it, another unhelpful binary. But I've also suggested that there are important differences between mad and queer that need teasing out. They are not equivalent. Understanding what madness might be, both as an experience, a category, and a way of seeing the world, can teach us something about ourselves and our wider psychosocial world. So if we really attend to mad knowledge, it's helped us already transform the way we understand certain experiences that have been psychiatrized and pathologized, most notably around self-harm and hearing voices. We've seen a massive transformation, I think, in the way that both these experiences have been transformed through attending to survivor knowledge. I'm just going to give one example of that in relation to self-harm, and this really important would probably be called a zine now at the time, a booklet on self-harm perspectives and personal experience. When I did my first piece of research about self-injury back in the early 1990s, this was a key text that really started the self-harm movement and started to help to really shape how we've begun to understand self-harm in different ways. But these sort of reclaiming and reframing and experiences hasn't just been about understanding them and depathologizing them, important though that is. It's also shed light on our wider practices, our wider psychosocial practices, if you like. So hearing voices has helped us understand our own inner voices, our own inner critics, whether or not we might hear voices as such. And self-harm, that activism around self-harm and attending to lived experience around self-harm has really helped us to think about our own ways in which we might all self-harm and live in a self-harming society, or how certain forms of self-harm are acceptable and certain forms of self-harm aren't. For example, overworking is very acceptable, but self-injury isn't. So whilst these experiences are really important, and they have helped to transform both clinical practice and public understandings of self-harm and hearing voices, this is very much an unfinished project. I would suggest that taking lived experience seriously means attending to the breadth, depth and diversity of lived experience, And that means not just experiences that might be easy for us to relate to, i.e. talking about mental health, the safe kind of conversations around mental health, but not also just experiences that suit our own political view, whether we might be pro or anti-diagnosis, medication, or whatever, or experiences that make sense within our own preferred frameworks of understanding, whether that's trauma-informed, psychosocial, neurodiversity, biomedical, spiritual, or whatever. Mad knowledge isn't just a critique of what might be framed as mainstream psychology or psychiatric knowledge. It's also a critique of more critical or seemingly progressive alternative frameworks too. So we've seen some really interesting and important work by critical psychologists in the last few years. For example, some involvement in the recovery model, the power threat meaning framework, and the British Psychological Society depression report, Understanding Depression. All of these are really important, I think, but also have come under criticism by some service users. And I'm thinking about the power threat meaning framework here, particularly as an example. And Asylum magazine published an important, I think, article about that a few years ago. I think why I'm highlighting this is because while these frameworks in many ways are much more progressive than a more biomedical framing of mental illness, if you like, there are some issues regarding how far lived experience is consulted in developing these models and practices. And I think one of the possible unintended consequences of this is it becomes another dominant framework, or potentially another dominant framework, and we no longer see lived experience that doesn't fit that framework. So I'm thinking in relation to trauma-informed or psychosocial frameworks, and how, if they are seen as the answer or the model, can have an impact, for example, on trans people. So trans people might be seen as having trauma, experiencing trauma, and therefore we need to be psychologized. Autism and neurodiversity can be overly psychologized. And another really important issue is in the way that people with chronic fatigue, ME, and various medically unexplained illnesses have been psychologized and psychiatrized. And interestingly enough, whilst critical psychologists might be at the forefront, if you like, of critical frameworks in relation to certain experiences, in relation to ME and CFS and experiences like that, lived experience is very much informing us that a psychological or a psychosocial approach is very limited when it comes to those experiences. And I'm highlighting this because I think in these examples, sometimes ideology trumps lived experience. And I think while theory generation is important, and I think the trauma-informed approaches are really helpful and highlighting the fact that many people in the mental health system have experienced trauma, those theories must be held lightly and be open to examples of lived experience that doesn't fit or that contradicts it. ECT is a great example of this. So I think I certainly for many years was very anti-ECT, and I've met people who've been damaged by ECT, but also people who feel like their lives have been saved by ECT. And I've come to the conclusion really that both of these things can be true. And this is what I'm referring to as paradoxical truths. Why might they not both be true? So these paradoxical experiences are precisely why they need to be taken seriously. But the idea of holding theory lightly refers to survivor-driven theory too. So in this, I want to just mention an important piece of work by Anne Plum back in '94, where she questioned the application of the social model of disability to madness and distress. And this was really important because when later survivors and activists were starting to reformulate the social model, Anne's questioning of whether it was appropriate using her own lived experience was really important. So myself and colleagues used we reproduced Anne's pamphlet as it wasn't very well known, and asked Anne to update her perspectives on this in a book that we published. So this is an example really of how survivor literature needs to be more attunely attended to, and I think Anne's questions around the social model of disability are still very relevant today. So what basically I'm arguing really is the importance of what Teshin Noorani has referred to as deep experiential knowledge. So knowledge generated when people's experience are collectivized through time, to find ways to create a dialogue with and not a monologue about madness. So given the complexity and paradoxical nature of lived experience, this really requires us to sit with ambivalence and uncertainty, not assuming that particular experiences are understandable or narratable, especially within our own preferred frameworks, but also that they're not necessarily irrational or incomprehensible either, but being open to what they could mean. So I've written extensively about various ways of doing this, particularly around therapeutic communities, stuff around truth and reconciliation, deep engagement with survivor movements and social activism. But most recently, myself and colleagues have been exploring the potential of zines through a Wellcome Trust funded project called Crafting Contention, the role of zines in challenging mental health theory and practice. And this builds on previous work where it explored survivor activist cartoons published in Asylum magazine as a form of survivorship as crafting contention about particular forms of knowledge about madness. So building on that work, and in this project, we're collecting, exploring and co-creating radical mental health zines, what we're calling MadZines. And it's no coincidence that we've seen the re-emergence of zines in the last 10 years or so, no doubt inspired by new identity and experientially based movements. People often make zines when they feel like their experience is not represented, validated or recognised in mainstream diagnostic or even alternative psychological literature or frameworks. For example, people with medically unexplained symptoms whose experience have been described as epistemological purgatory or diagnostic limbo, when their experience doesn't fit prevailing medical trauma or recovery models. So I just want to give some examples of two sorts of zines that we're working with. One is zines, sort of personal experience zines, and collectively produced zines, what might be called comp zines or collective zines. And I want to give some examples of those alongside aligned psychology practices, which I think complement them. So the first example are three examples of comp zines, if you like. And these are from three kind of groups of survivors. So one edited by MadCovid, and MadCovid is an organisation that was developed during COVID to highlight the ongoing issues of people who've already, not people who may be suffering mental health issues as a reaction to COVID, but people who are already in the mental health system and whose lives are sometimes getting worse throughout the COVID crisis. Dear GP is a really interesting zine about service users basically flipping the microscope and showing how professionals write up clients. So rather than the medical notes written about patients, Dear GP collects patients writing up notes about their own experience, but they're writing up notes as if they were writing up clinical notes about their doctors or mental health professionals or psychologists. And this has been a really powerful zine around sort of reclaiming some of those experiences and turning the microscope back onto professionals, if you like. And the third one is Recovery in the Bin, which have produced a zine. And this is a really important organisation and a really important zine because it highlights a survivor-driven concept of neo-recovery. So recovery under neoliberalism, and it's a really important concept, I think. And in relation to a sort of psychology practices that I think complement these is Psychologists Against Austerity, which is an organisation that have done really important work, I think, in identifying what they've called particular psychosocial austerity ailments. And I think this is a really important example of psychologists taking experience seriously and forging alliances with service user groups. These are some examples of zines. So zines, or more autobiographical zines, if you like, or zines written by one individual drawing on their own experiences. And these zines are really interesting because in a sort of wider psychologized culture that's saturated with simplistic and individualized self-care messages, survivors have kind of made zines about their own struggles, which don't necessarily sit comfortably with a recovery or self-care discourse. And I've chosen these three just out of there's many I could have chosen. The zine about shitfulness was so interesting, we decided to republish it in Asylum magazine, and it kind of draws attention to the problems in the mainstreaming of mindfulness. The unhealthy zine is really interesting. It highlights what is, I don't know if you can read it, but it says on coping with pain in socially inappropriate ways. And that zine really made me think about how we pathologize certain ways of coping with distress and illness and not others. And it's a really interesting zine that explores some of the difficulties around that. And I think these zines can give us a real insight into what some of those difficulties and complexities actually are. And the third zine kind of speaks for itself, I think. And a psychology practice that I think nicely complements those is what we published in the last issue of Asylum magazine, which is a psychologist, Kate Quinn, who's developed with survivors idea of heavy metal therapy and anti-wellness. So it's a psychologized truth, if you like, that listening to angry music, heavy metal, is not good for one's mental health. And you should listen to nice calming music. And they have questioned this and actually listened to heavy metal music. And I think that's an interesting sort of counterpoint to ideas around self-help and self-care. So an important part of this project is exploring how zines can test and challenge psi-centered knowledge about particular psychopathologized experiences and how they craft new forms of knowledge. And we're doing this through looking at what resonates with us and what unsettles or challenges our own thinking about mental health or madness and distress. So borrowing an idea from Arthur Frank's book, Letting Stories Breathe, we're suggesting that zines might enable experience and madness to breathe. And we're trying to explore this really through making zines. So my colleague Jill Anderson, as well as Tamsin and to some extent myself and our other colleagues, and Jackie Beatty, who's worked on some of the images for our project, is trying to work on some of these ideas through making zines. So this is just a page from one of Jill's recent zines about zines letting stories breathe. And with this, we're trying to argue that zines might enable individuals, as in zines, and groups of organisations like Recovery in the Bin or whatever, what I'm calling, or what Frank calls, hold their own, i.e. maintain a sense of dignity while still expressing our vulnerability and our needs despite threats to the self. And those threats might come from illness, distress, disability, wider formations like misrecognition, discrimination and epistemic injustice. And holding your own, I think, is a really nice way to summarise what that is. And also Arthur Frank's idea of companion stories. And I think zines often work as companions to people's lives. And I carry around a zine with me now, about a little tiny zine saying you don't have to do everything, which I found really helpful in my own life. So the zine medium, which can comprise text, images, collage, and come in all shapes and sizes, can be multidimensional. And as such, I think they enable the articulation of much more raw, unfiltered, unedited, messy, and unfinalizable and diverse experiences and reflections. And they embody what the zine scholar Paula Cameron has called seamfulness, i.e. they let all their seams show. They're not nice and tidy and finished and theorized. They show us some of the more complexities of lived experience. So our engagement with zines has to some extent enabled us to engage with the more messy, conflicting and paradoxical experience of madness. And these are often missing in mainstream and alternative critical academic frameworks. And engaging with mediums like zines has allowed us to experience what the comics scholar Nick Sousanis refers to as unflattening. So when I said before that a lot of our knowledge about mental health flattens our experience, the comics scholar, and he doesn't talk about this, but we're sort of trying to play with this idea about how different, like drawing and comics and different ways of understanding experience helps us to simultaneously engage with multiple vantage points to engender new ways of seeing that text doesn't necessarily allow. So in relation to zines, and we've really seen a proliferation of zines and MadZine type activity in the last few years, including a new project by Lilith Cooper called Take It Back. And there's a nice blog about this on the Polyphony website. And they say, it was in zines that I found a space for the complicated, nuanced, non-linear and situated experience of madness, mental health and recovery. Zines are a place of plurality and perfectly suited for talking about madness and mental health, in which there is not one fixed or right way to understand or communicate your experience. So I just want to end, I think I've got just a couple of minutes, just to end on a few warnings and caveats, as are always important. Firstly, I realise I've been pretty selective in the choices of what material I've highlighted, and I think, you know, they're material that particularly speaks to me, I guess. The other thing in speaking to a psychology audience is zines should not be, I don't think, mined for material to be psychologized or interpreted. I remember when I was doing my research about cartoons, how one survivor referred to her analysis of her own cartoons as like a mental state examination, which totally missed the point of her work. I've seen similar criticisms to how some psychologists have used or mined social media for information from what service users are saying. So with this in mind, in our project, we're working with the complex ethics of researching zines, which tries to be sensitive both to the ethics of zine culture and survivor experiences, and what we're calling a MadZine sensibility. The other thing we're starting to look at as well is some of the negative aspects of zine culture, or the limiting aspects. Of course, one might say the rise of perzines particularly reflects a selfie or psychologized culture. And despite zines' DIY nature and their radical aspirations, they do have radical roots in the counterculture, if you like. A zine culture, like any culture, is a culture, and as such it may be exclusionary as well as inclusionary. The zine medium itself and the culture around it may enable the articulation of some experiences, but close down others. So zine culture, or what's called zine culture now, zinesters, people who make zines, are often articulate, educated, middle class, arty and woke, even though they might have, and they usually have, out with type experiences, if you like, experiences that are on the margins in other ways. So with this in mind, our PhD researcher Tamsin Walker is looking at how zines might be used by survivors who are not represented in zine, classic zine or service user communities. And Tamsin has written a comic on our website as a short comic strip about that. So I think this is one of the reasons, one of the issues here is what I'm trying to argue here is how attending to the proliferation of survivor media is important. And it's important to attend to the multiplicity of lived experience. So really, to conclude, engaging with survivor produced literature like zines is one way to become more attuned to individually and collectively produced knowledge. There are many other ways too. But I think this is necessary to enable critical scholarship to be more open to our diverse and competing experiences and critiques of our own practice too, not always assuming that critique is out there, not at ourselves. And I think this ensures a broader politics of mental health, and whatever disciplines we are located within really starts to take experience seriously. If you want to find out more about our zine project, I've given some links here. I think I'm just finishing time. So I hope some of these ideas has been helpful. I hope it's resonated in some way with some of your own thoughts about working with lived experience. And I'm really delighted to have a conversation and discussion about some of these ideas. And I wish the new centre well, and I hope we can have a really good discussion about some of these ideas. So thank you so much for listening.
So I think that means discussion. So first will be Dr. Simon Clarke, who is a lecturer in critical mental health. Is that right, Simon?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, so lecturer in critical mental health at the School of Psychology. Over to you.
Okay, yeah, just want to say thank you, Helen. I really enjoyed the talk, and I found it both thought-provoking, challenging, stimulating in all the kind of right ways. And I particularly like the idea of zines. To me, it kind of seemed almost like a anti-self-help. It's like an anti-self-help movement in a way, because it kind of really offers, it seems, the way what self-help communities would probably want to have, but in a lot more of a inclusive and but challenging and witty and creative type of a way. And I particularly like the idea of heavy metal therapy and heavy metal zines. I would like to fly the standard for a prog rock zine, but I think particularly I really like the subversion of these kind of that we all know in a certain lived experience way to be untrue, and yet they still in self-help ways get problemated. You know, we need calm listening music rather than something that really speaks to our experience in a really deep way. As you mentioned with Naruni's concept of deep experience. I made a lot of notes. I did have some points, but you kind of covered them in the talk, I think, in lots of ways. So I've got some things to think about, some questions that really stimulated me, and things that I've been thinking about as well for a while. And I love the idea of zines being this kind of creative, challenging way of using experience. But I also wonder how and in what ways, maybe that's not their purpose, but how and in what ways they can influence the kind of mainstream of psychiatric services, given that many people who use psychiatric services don't have that kind of access to that kind of creativity and community that the zines offer. And it really struck me that in some respects there is a kind of I mean, the philosopher Jose Medina talks about hermeneutical responsibility, particularly for those in power, and particularly for those who've kind of embedded within structures of power, and to what degree those people who do hold, how they can be influenced and how they can be challenged to kind of think in more inclusive ways, particularly within the side professions. And zines seem to offer that, but I wonder to sort of what degree they can make, or should they make their way into the mainstream? Is that a purpose, or would that? And with that, is there something about a representation of double bind here, that in terms of representing madness in this kind of very creative and very disruptive, I would say very real, authentic. I know you know I've talked a lot about authenticity, and the fact that this is a very good example, to my mind, of what you might call tactical authenticity, using lived experience in a very politically informed way. But then in terms of when you're influencing the mainstream, to what degree that can take away the radical edge and rob it of its ability to speak. But yeah, if you can't speak in the first place, then the voice isn't getting heard. And I think I called about this the psychiatric different, you know, building on Lyotard's work. Lyotard talks about the different, about how within existing structures, the ability to even speak becomes almost impossible. So when you talk about mad experience, particularly its more extreme and disruptive elements, as soon as you start trying to put that into the structures that we know exist, particularly within the side disciplines and in psychology as a discipline, how much that kind of takes away the experience of its true edge and makes it into something that it isn't. So that was another thing that really got me thinking. I also wondered, as kind of a sort of a final point, was about the category mad, and I'm really glad that you identified some of the issues with mad as an identity category. On one hand, it's been a massively influential and creative way and challenging way, and a way that mad people and people with lived experience of severe mental disorder or mental illness, however you want to call it, have been able to reclaim their experiences and use a label that kind of fits much better than the psychiatric categories that very often have been forced upon them. But I also wonder, to what extent does that that label or that identity category, whatever you want to call it, how that can itself be exclusive, particularly for people that may not identify as mad or may not be able to see their experiences kind of fit in that sort of framework. And actually, in a sense, are we perhaps in a danger, or could we be in a danger, where mad studies, mad pride, and the mad identity category itself becomes a dominant discourse, and then who's in and who's out, and perhaps more importantly, who says and who has the power to say who's in and who are out. And I know these are questions that are ongoing, but these are just kind of the type of questions that your talk really inspired for me, and which have been on my mind for a while. So thank you again. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Simon. Laura, would you like to say your piece? Just let me just say, you are a lecturer in psychosocial studies.
Yeah.
So Laura is a School of Psychology psychosocial studies lecturer.
Hi. Yeah, thanks so much for your talk, Helen. I really enjoyed it, and yeah, it's also sparked off lots of ideas, and Simon has said some of them, so I'll just try and reformulate it. So I think I'm really pleased to be a part of this, and for you to come and talk to us today, because I've been a really long-term admirer of your work, and I really liked the way in your talk you really brought forward and made really explicit that a lot of the questions that you're dealing with are not fixed, they're not settled, but these are ongoing dilemmas and tensions that there are in work, which does try and kind of work seriously with the experience. And I thought particularly one of the things that I've always really liked about your work is the way that you manage to be genuinely rooted in activist communities, but also bring a really robust theoretical academic lens to your work. And I think that's really difficult to pull off, and it's certainly something that I felt a big tension in whenever I've done more kind of activist type work, like Psychologists Against Austerity, which you talked about a bit. And because I think it's really difficult, because sometimes those commitments to activism and to the communities that you're working alongside, and to theory and to the kind of more to critique and those kind of things, can pull you in different directions. And also they kind of produce these dilemmas about power and representation, about who our theories are for, what our theories do in the world, who we get to speak to and who other people don't get to speak to, as well as academics. Or with Psychologists Against Austerity, lots of people were practitioners that we were working with, and also having that knowledge that psychology and kind of formal academic knowledge are not always welcome or wanted in social movements at all. In fact, they've often been those have often been experiences which have harmed people. So it's tricky, and I think there's been a big theme going through the launch about thinking about socially engaged psychology, social justice, open academia, And it's really important of us to remember that these are not kind of simple things to do, and they have to be done carefully. And of course, the politics of knowledge are particularly acute in madness, because, as you talked about, people's experiences have been variously dismissed, pathologized, delegitimized. But I think it's broader as well. This is true of kind of any academia which tries to engage with social movements of any kind. So I think it's hard to think about theory in these ways. Sometimes, obviously, theory can be a power move, a kind of imposition, where you're imposing an understanding on people, which is exactly what these kinds of movements are against, or trying to organize against. But also, sometimes I think theory can help to kind of articulate practices or give credence to groups and ideas which otherwise remain marginalized. So exactly the kinds of experiential knowledge communities which you talked about today, which don't easily gain mainstream recognition. Although, as Simon said, that can be tricky as well, about bringing ideas into the mainstream can sometimes rob them of their power. So I think it's really tricky to find that balance of using theory as a kind of spotlight or a kind of power but without slipping into kind of taking over or taking credit for other people's work. So more of a power over. So I really like the work that you're doing with zines, which exactly seem like this kind of balance, that kind of work, where you're drawing attention to a practice which already exists, and has this potential to open up new possibilities for beyond that, the kind of the context in which it's emerged. What the other thing that made me really think about was the tension that you also talked about really, really nicely through the talk, is about trying to represent and make sense of experiences which sit outside rationalist norms. And I think this, especially when the forms that we normally provide for people to communicate those experiences sit very much within those rationalist norms themselves. So it's made me think a bit of Angela Woods's work, where she's talked about the accounts of mad experience which appear in Schizophrenia Bulletin. And she talks about how those tend to be written from a position of recovered rationality, kind of looking back at madness in the past, but as keeping a distance from it. And certainly, I think that kind of tendency, a kind of sanitized version of mad experiences, comes up a lot in research as well. So certainly in interviews, I've found people will often skate over kind of years of their life with euphemisms like "I had a breakdown," and that covers kind of 5 years of something that happens to people, of all of that kind of complexity of experience. So I think that kind of, it's so easy to, even beyond the kind of politics of knowledge, to also reproduce that kind of polite social norm, sanitized version of madness, even when research contexts which are genuinely trying to engage with experience. So I really like that term seamfulness from the zines research, and I think we need kind of greater seamfulness in the kinds of in the material that we engage with in psychology research, as well as thinking, always being really aware of the power dynamics that are involved in knowledge production. So I really liked the emphasis all the way through your talk on messiness, plurality and complexity, and how we have to hold those qualities at the forefront when we're working in a way that takes experience seriously. And I'd certainly I think that you're right that even experience-based knowledge can become sometimes fixed and sometimes wielded as authority in exactly the same way that science can be wielded as authority. So it's really important to keep that lightness of theory and lightness of perspective as we try and navigate these kind of topics. So thank you very much for your talk.
Sorry, unmuting myself. Thanks a lot, Laura. I wonder, Helen, would you like to react before we kind of open it up to everyone else, or oh, you are not?
Yeah, thank you both so much, Laura and Simon. I think yeah, it's yeah, I don't know where to start, but well, firstly, thank you, Laura, for saying that I've managed to this tension between theory and activism, because I sometimes don't feel like I have, but so it's really nice that that does come across. It's certainly something that I've attempted to do, but it is a difficult place to be, because sometimes I think one of the anxieties I had about doing this talk was, oh, I'm not clever enough, you know, I'm not using enough theory to be a proper keynote speaker. And that's the thing about having, you know, the theory bit and holding that lightly, but also I'm also thinking, well, I'm not enough in the survivor movement too. So it's that really difficult. And I think in one paper, myself and Mark Krausswood talked about, you know, the lived contradictions of doing this kind of work. And it is really painful at times, but it feels really necessary to do it. So it's really nice to hear that, you know, maybe that, you know, it's working to some extent, and it's always going to be imperfect anyway. It's never going to be perfect. And it's always something that we're aspiring towards. You know, and something that is very much a work in progress. I think the idea of tactical authenticity is a lovely way of thinking about zines, actually, because that really feels like it's a nice way of framing what zinesters are doing. I think that the thing about influence is really interesting and important. There's a lovely book called Notes from the Underground that I really like by Stephen Duncombe. And this isn't about mental health, but he talks about zines and the conflicts at the heart of zine culture, which reflects broader sort of politics and anarchist politics, if you like, that, you know, you're trying to do something really countercultural and alternative, but at the same time you're wanting to influence the mainstream. But as soon as you do that, you're no longer alternative and counterculture anymore. So you're kind of trapped. And I think zines are in exactly that position, particularly the more subversive zines, which, you know, obviously do want to have influence and impact. But at the same time, if they started to be, you know, given out in training and they were like, you know, circulated in trusts, they wouldn't be doing what they're meant to be doing. So it's a really difficult situation. I suppose one of the things, there's many ways of approaching that, I think. And one of the things I think we did try and do in Asylum magazine is to be a little bit of both, you know, to be a bit like a zine, but also try to speak to the mainstream as well. And the other thing is I think a lot of zinesters do what might be called guerrilla marketing. So they might just take a load of zines and leave them in their mental health centre or psychiatric ward or something like that. And of course, that is, you know, that's a lovely, potentially brilliant subversive act. So patients, if you like, would have access to them. But also, again, going back to the conflict, it's unlikely to have a massive impact because you can only do it at one place at a time. So I think it sort of speaks more broadly to the politics of the counterculture, if you like, and the limitations of that. But I suppose the way I see it is that the zine culture and mad culture, and this also speaks to the idea of madness, I think, as well, is that it's an important, in a way, consciousness raising development. And that, like you say, once either zines become standardized and sort of top down, and they are starting to do that, and certainly trusts are starting to produce zines about schizophrenia or how to manage your schizophrenia as a zine, you know, and the recovery colleges starting to do zines, you know. Once that starts to happen, and the same as if mental health service were called mad services, I think then we'd be in trouble. And I think it becomes subversive because it's like queer, isn't it? It needs to be that until it's no longer needed to some extent. And I think there is a problem with it becoming the new orthodoxy, because it is very much one perspective from the margins, and it's not going to be acceptable to many people. In fact, you know, one of the criticisms of it is most long-term service users stuck in mental health service would find it probably pretty problematic. But that's not dissimilar to how many LGBT people found queer in the early days too. I mean, certainly I remember, you know, back in the day being a little bit wincy when queer came along, thinking, oh my God, spent our whole lives trying to say that we're not queer, and now we're supposed to say that we are. So it's a similar kind of thing to that. And I think still many LGBT people feel uncomfortable with the whole queer thing. So I think it's a really difficult, there's no really easy answer to this. And I think with anything, with any identity, with any concept or theory, it's going back to this idea of holding them lightly and making sure that we're up for them to be criticized and for them to be subverted, if you like, and that to some extent has to happen. But I think you're right that the trickiness of it all is absolutely right, and I think it has to be tricky. And once we start thinking we've got a solution to this stuff, I think that's when we're probably in trouble. That's when we're probably going, I think we've had it here. Because these things are never going to be that straightforward, unfortunately. And there is a danger of being an echo chamber, I think. And that tension between dialogue and engagement, but also trying to maintain some sense of subversion. I think it's a constant ask, and it's not just about madness and zines. It's, you know, any sort of social movement. So I think one of the things I'd say is that we need to learn from other social movements, and also other social movements can learn from mad movements too. I think there needs to be more of that.
Thanks, Helen. I would like to ask something. I was just wondering that, because I thought your talk was remarkable, really, because it wasn't just a claim for kind of the legitimacy of self-expression. It was also starting to question of how this is more than self-expression. This can be knowledge, and I think that's what's really radical about it. Well, perhaps it's not just what's radical, but that kind of takes it even one level further. And I wonder whether, you know, when we talk about the mainstream, the issue becomes that it becomes detached from the experience. So I was thinking about heavy metal therapy. I don't know what heavy metal therapy is. I just kind of, you know, you look at the zine and you kind of imagine something, and you can see it working on the level of self-expression, which is brilliant in itself. And then you can kind of see it working as a kind of critique of the status quo and subversive. But then imagine if it had become something kind of promoted and, you know, outcome research and distributed and self-help books and just listen to 5 minutes of whatever, you know. So you can see when it becomes a thing and it's not rooted in experience. I think that's the mainstream, that it's kind of becomes, it's not about the experience anymore. It's not rooted there anymore. And what I wanted to ask you, it was about your editorship of the Asylum magazine, because you said kind of half, it was a half joke. I understood it as a half joke that you read more of the kind of submissions to the magazine than the academic, and I thought it's interesting. You know, the fact that there's, you know, 2 kind of publications, the academic publications producing the academic knowledge, which we kind of all are supposed to read and discuss and all that. And then Asylum magazine is a publication, and it does have an editor, and it has an editor board. But so in a way, it's not in that sense a million miles. There are submissions, and I was wondering, so, and then what happens? So how do you kind of contrast the editorial process or your experience as an editor of Asylum magazine to what's going on when it comes to official academic knowledge production?
That's a great question. It's something that I struggle with. And it wasn't really a joke in a sense. I definitely spend much more time with Asylum submissions than I do with academic submissions, and I take them both as seriously as each other. I don't do as much academic reviewing as I used to, partly because I do much more Asylum stuff. And it is, you're right, and in a sense, Asylum magazine isn't a zine in a classic sense, because one of the definitions of a zine is that it's not edited. And we do edit stuff that comes in, even though we have some of the ethos. We're low budget, you know, not for profit, you know, countercultural, that sort of stuff. But we, you know, it is edited, and we have an editorial collective, and you know, it goes through that process, and we curate it, if you like, as well. So we create the magazine, and people themselves don't curate it. But I do have a lot of ongoing discussions with people who submit articles, and most of them, not all, but most of them are either survivors, service users, or activists. And I try and work very closely with them and around, you know, what ends up looking like, what images might go with it. Because one of the things that I'm trying to do is make sure that it's populated with a diverse types of material. So photographs, images, poems, cartoons, comic strips, all that sort of stuff is, and really working with, and there are a lot of really fantastic survivor cartoonists and artists out there, and sort of working with them on making the magazine really work in so many different ways. So I suppose when reviewing material for Asylum, I'm looking at something slightly different than I would for an academic article. So for an academic article, I would look for the classic things that most academics would look for. I might look at it in a slightly different way, but I would be looking at, you know, issues of rigor and argument and all that sort of stuff, and referencing. But with Asylum, I put all that aside, you know, and I explicitly say we don't need references. It doesn't need to have a kind of clear, solid, evidenced argument. You know, it can be really raw. I mean, but it does have to have a critical edge to it somehow. It's really interesting. I've never really thought about the differences in that way, and I might go away and think about that a little bit more, because it is really interesting, actually. But I do find it much more pleasant experience doing Asylum submissions than academic articles, although there are some good exceptions to that. And people here today, I think, well, sharing in this panel would be good exceptions to that, you know. But some of the time, and also because we do Asylum magazine, it's much shorter submissions, so we just have very two-page submissions, whereas an article can be 8,000 words long, and you know as well as I do how long that can take to review and give it a considerable thought, which they all require to do. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a really interesting one.
Thanks. From the floor, we have a question from Johanna Motzkow. She asked about the role of attunement, which you mentioned in your talk at the end, and also how zines would or could feed into critical research perspectives. Yeah,
that's why I posted a blog that myself and Jill Anderson wrote about the zine methodology that we're trying to develop, which we wrote earlier in the project. But basically, we're really trying to work, rather than have a conventional way to approach zines, you know, like we'll get them and we code them and analyze them and that type of stuff. We're really not doing that, or, you know, I do a little bit of that. You know, we are starting to think about how we might categorize different sorts of zines, but we're not analyzing them in a sort of classic way. So one of the things we're trying to do is use zines to think about how, so for example, a good example is the holding your own idea from Arthur Frank. So Jill is working on developing a zine which explores some of those ideas, and Tamsin, the PhD student, has made a zines are conversation zine and is circulating it amongst the team. So we're adding to it. And the good thing about zines is they're not finished, they are seamless. So you can kind of add to, you can put stickers on it and contradict yourself. You know, you can tear bits out and add bits to it. So sort of using that methodology as a way to do research is a kind of interesting, but quite not an easy thing to think about. And I think we're drawing on sort of more arts-based methods or creative methods, or craftivism as well, and ideas around that to do so. So I suppose it's sort of The thing about attunement is interesting because it's kind of about how we're trying to be attuned to what the zinester is trying to do, but also attuned to how it's making us, how it's sort of unsettling and challenging our own. So it's resonating with our own experiences, but maybe challenging them or making us think about them. A bit like Simon was saying about the talk, you know, kind of some bits resonate, some bits challenge. And we're sort of trying to do that with zines and kind of sit with them. And we use this idea from Frank. Frank talks about thinking with stories rather than thinking about stories. So we're trying to do that, thinking with zines rather than about. Well, we are thinking about zines, but also trying to think with them. So having them as a sort of medium and as a method, and trying to have that as a new way of seeing. So it's a little bit like Nick Susanis is talking about in relation to comics being a new way of seeing, and that maybe zines are a new way of seeing. And I suppose, and that might, and that's my argument, I guess, is that that might be much more appropriate to lived experience, because lived experience is much more like a zine than other things. So I think, again, it's very much a work in progress. Any thoughts and any ideas, if anyone thinks, oh, this might be quite useful to think about that, then do let me know or contact us, because like I say, we're very much sort of working with these ideas as we go along. But it is, zines are one of the most exciting sort of mediums I've come across in many years of working around mental health, although, you know, they're not a panacea for sure. Any medium has its difficulties and problems, as we've already kind of discussed, and I think more of them will come out. But I think as a method, it's quite interesting. And I think
it kind of, it made me wonder. You wrote a blog about how to say, when you notice or discover this kind of new data, as well, this is all terminology, but it is data still, yeah, of some sort. Then you also kind of discover a necessity for new methodology. And I wanted, it's actually, I think, for all of you guys, because I mean, you all had this experience during your recent research, Simon and Laura as well, that when you encounter some sort of new material, that can't help but make you think about new ways of kind of collecting it, analyzing it, or after a while perhaps it's not even analysis anymore. So I was wondering whether you have any thoughts about it. So how this new material opens up your methodology really willy-nilly. Yeah, whoever wants to go first.
Can you just repeat that, David? I'm sorry, I was just reading a comment that came in the chat and I missed the last bit you were saying.
Well, how new material, how new research data will open up your methodologies, and you end up thinking about, you're not just applying whatever type of analysis or data collection or whatever you've been familiar with, even if that had been cutting edge, but by necessity you will have to kind of look again at your ideas of how to approach it. So it opens up your methodology. But it's really a question for Simon and Laura as well, because they have experience doing it. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to dive in. I think for me it was that question of how to represent madness, because I think, and I use a methodology called autoethnography, which is kind of like an autobiographical type of methodology. But even within the constraints of autobiography, one of my problems was that it tended to be represented in this very kind of linear sort of way, as I think Laura was saying about the first person perspectives in, I think it was schizophrenia bulletin, wasn't it? They tend to record things in a very standardized way, and even more disruptive forms of autoethnography still, I think, didn't really, they still had it it was too curated. And that kind of led me to kind of present my data as it were. Even calling it data, I think, can feel problematic, because I think it does almost like an injustice to the experience of its totality by carving it up into little pieces. So I think in terms of when you come to new experiences or experiences that have been marginalized, I think trying to put them in established methodologies, you feel like I felt personally like I was doing a real injustice to the experience. It was two things. One, it was a personal kind of epistemic pain almost in that, but also in terms of representation, it felt like it was inadequate. It wasn't doing the reader any favor by presenting it in this kind of linear and structured way. So I think when you're encountering experience, that you're trying to do justice for the reader so that you can get across something of the nature of the experience, but also almost to yourself as well. It's because it's your experience, because it's so personal. You feel like you have an obligation to your own experience and also to the experience of other people who've been through similar experiences. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but that was my first impression.
Yeah, I think I suppose my overall take on data and material is I've just never felt like any of it is adequate. So especially the sort of, because I suppose I've tried to not use the more traditional, narrative interview and done kind of visual methods, but even that, really, you still get very particular stories from people. They're still a bit like if you're ever doing an interview with people who've been in services for many years, it's a bit like a clinical stuff that kind of, so I suppose I don't really feel like I have kind of found an adequate data collection, really, but I do think what probably helps are multiplicity of data, so thinking about things coming from lots of different angles at once, and not, alongside our kind of sitting down and talking to somebody, kind of using other material as well that's maybe available in the world, and then stuff like Helen is doing, which is using the ways that people represent their own experiences as a starting point, rather than starting with our idea of how people should represent their experiences, which then obviously, because when we're talking about things that are already outside norms and are difficult to represent, if we can start as close as possible to how people do that themselves, I think that's a good starting point, at least.
They certainly, I mean, if we come back to these zines, there is an aesthetic to them which we just can't be sidestepped. Without the, when you look at it, it's just it's really constitutive of it. Is there anything else you wanted to say about this, Helen? Or
can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think my connection is bad, and it keeps freezing, so I'm not sure if I'm still here. Yes, are you still there?
You are absolutely here. I mean, my problem is I'm here twice because I can hear myself talking.
Well, I think I'm only half here, although I want to be fully here. But yeah, so I missed that last bit because I was frozen out. I'm sorry.
That's right. It's just whether you would like to say anything more about how the novelty of material will open up your methodology.
I think inevitably it has to. And I think that we're only really scratching the surface on what that might mean. And in any research project I've done, I've always tried to mirror whatever it is I'm researching in the process itself, a bit like a parallel process, I guess, in a positive way, and so in a sense, I'm trying to mirror zine practice, or we're trying to mirror zine practice in our methods, but also maintain a critical distance, and that's also quite tricky. So I think the key is, like as you said, is the opening up again, and keeping that open, and realizing some of the limitations as well as the possibilities that might open up from doing that. But being someone who's not very creative, at all. This has been a real challenge for me. So I'm really well out of my comfort zone with this stuff, which is, I think, good for me, but not always very easy to navigate.
I was always under the impression that we have plenty of time for discussion, and now I realize actually running out of time. But I do want to ask something, because Darren Langley asked something I think very important. He talks about, refers that bit to your presentation when you talked about ECT, and he says how important he finds this kind of holding two ostensibly contradictory positions at the same time. And I think it's really important because it kind of shows how non-banal an activity is to be open. Because of course, when you're open, then exactly one thing that happens is that you get the oppositional kind of polarized things. And what do you do then? And so his question is whether you would like to say something about the tensions between these positions, and any whether you seek any sense of resolution, or how the dialogue proceeds. I should also point out that actually the CUSP session finished on this note, which I think is very interesting, this polarized debates and what we do with them. So I guess that's a really nice last question for us as well.
Yeah, so basically I'm increasingly come to the conclusion that whilst we need, I think a lot of the polarized debates we're getting into are really two sides of the same coin. It's almost like, in Buddhist terms, it's like a diamond, and one side is a reflection of the other side, if you like. And I think seeing them as contradictions, which I used to see things more as contradictions in a more Marxist sense, you know, and then we had to have something that overcome them, a new truth to overcome it all, if you like, which I think there's something in that too. But also the idea that one paradox, that the paradoxical truth will shine a broader light on something more important, and that actually when we take a position, i.e. anti-ECT, pro-ECT, anti-diagnosis, pro-diagnosis, whatever, rather than see them as opposing categories, we actually need to see them as both truths that shine a light on something more, the deeper of importance. And in so doing, what I've done quite a lot of work around is thinking about restorative justice and truth and reconciliation, and having a dialogue where we don't shut each other down, we don't, you know, call each other names, and we don't say, you know, if you're pro ECT, if you say, oh, ECTs. I remember being at one event once where a survivor talked about ECT, having ECT in quite positive terms, and literally the whole audience turned around and booed. And they weren't booing her, they were booing her psychiatrist, but you could see that she shrank visibly in her seat, and disappeared. And I think when we start to, I think we really need more, we do need dialogue, but we really need to start with a position of deep listening. And I think this has come up again in other talks as well, that, you know, we don't necessarily have a position that we thrash over someone's head, but we can hold our positions with conviction. I think Darren talked about this in his talk last week as well, that we have convictions, and we need to have those convictions, but we also need to understand some of the opposing, or what feels like opposing, but I suspect they're not as opposing as they might seem. So there has been some work done around restorative justice and healing circles in relation to mental health. So people who've worked in mental health services, and people who feel like they've been abused in mental health services, and people who feel like they've been helped in mental health services. And again, on social media, I know this came up in Anne's discussion after Anne's talk, social media is really not the place to have these kinds of discussions, because they just get more and more polarized. We need more restorative spaces where we can really sit together and start to understand each other's perspectives. And I do think ultimately, I think Akiko Hart's written about this in relation to psychiatric diagnosis in an article again in Asylum magazine called choice, not truth. So rather than saying I have the truth about diagnosis being wrong or right, but deferring to what matters to someone in their particular circumstances and context. And I think that's really, really important. And we have to find ways to do that. Otherwise, we'll get more and more polarized. And ultimately, the people that suffer are the people who need the support. They're the people that are in the firing line. They're the people that are sort of stuck between these opposing camps. And I think it's so damaging and unhelpful. And I think restorative justice and different approaches to working with difficult issues is the way to go, and drawing on some different practices and knowledges on how to do that.